Welcome Joe Roskowski, who is an instructor in the OSU Department of Entomology. He'll be leading this session on social insects and overview. Joe is an instructor on main campus in Columbus, where he teaches several key department courses, including general entomology, intro to entomology, and social insects. Joe's an acclaimed instructor and has a special interest and expertise in ants and social parasitism. So Joe, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
All right, as Denise said, I teach several courses at the Department of Entomology at Ohio State, one of which, though, is social insects. So there's a lot of information out there, and we could talk for days, most likely, about this stuff. But today I'm just going to give you a brief overview, hit some of the main points that people find interesting about social insects. Okay, so title is Social Insects and Overview, and that's exactly what we're going to shoot for today. So to get started with, we consider ants, bees, wasps, termites as eusocial. Not all bees, not all wasps, but some are. All ants are eusocial, so are termites. And by eusocial we mean truly social. So part of what I'll do today is make sure you understand what we mean by that. To get started with, though, if we just think about the word social, what does that mean? So let's take a look at a dictionary definition. So this is living or disposed to live in companies or communities, desirous of enjoying the society or companionship of others. So if you take a quick look at this picture here, this is a beer hall, or it appears to be at least. We see a lot of things going on here, like a lot of communication, and this is going to be critical for society to remain intact, whether that's humans or insects. We're going to, if you take an even closer look, you see multiple generations, and that's going to be part of the definition of eusociality. So lots of cooperation, communication, overlapping generations, a tight unit, in other words. This is interesting to people because many animals are solitary. So think of a grizzly bear, they don't really hang out together unless it's time to mate. Same for hummingbirds, snakes, and many other animals. However, we do see within mammals things like lions who live in groups together, and a variety of other mammals as well. But in general, many animals are going to be solitary. Within insects, we see that some of them, like these lady beetles, will aggregate in large numbers. This isn't from mating, so it's a little bit different than what we saw with the bears and hummingbirds and snakes. They're actually just trying to get together to stay warm. So in this particular image, you can see quite a few lady beetles basking in the sun on a rock, which is a nice warm place. You've probably noticed this at your own home, that a lot of times you'll see when the weather's changing, getting cooler, a variety of bugs will try to make it in to your house because it's nice and warm. I know here on main campus in Columbus, there's certain stairwells that have glass walls, and those tend to be very well populated with insects moving into the winter. People don't always like this, but I find it interesting anyway. So moving forward here, when we think about types of social behavior, we're going to see that there is some sort of parental care in quite a few insects. But to start with, let's take a look at this walking stick. She's really just going to drop her eggs at random and provide them no other care whatsoever. So that's sort of the starting point of it. But then we can move into things like this true bug here that has piercing, sucking mouth parts. And you can see that she's standing over her group of nymphs. Okay, so these are insects. When they hatch out of the egg, they look like miniature adults for the most part. So they're going to be mobile, moving around, and they seek each other out. And then they also seek out their mother. And she seeks them out as well. She just stands over them to guard them. Gives it a better chance of surviving than, let's say, this scenario, the walking stick, where she just flicks it out to the ground. So she's going to guard the eggs at first, and she'll guard the young. Okay, and as I said, they're going to tend to seek each other out. Another example of this, another true bug. This is a giant water bug. This is sort of an interesting exception because the male is carrying the eggs on his back until they hatch. Most of the parental care we see in insects is going to involve the female. But in this case, this provides, again, protection to the eggs, gives them a better chance than if they were just left to fend for themselves. Another very interesting type of parental care is in burying beetles, because they find a carcass of whatever it might be, a mole or a rat, a mouse, something. They find it, they bury it, and then they lay eggs onto it. And then when the larvae hatch out, so this is a holometabolous insect, so it's going to go from egg to larvae to pupae to adult. They're going to hatch out of the egg in the larval form, which is very much like a grub, and then consume the carcass with the help of the parents as well. So a good example of a more involved type of parental care in insects. See the same kind of thing with dung beetles. So they're going to harvest the dung and roll it into balls, and then they lay the eggs within it. So if you take a look here, here you have your egg in the dung ball. Now it's in the larval stage, because again it's a holometabolous insect. It's going to consume a lot of that dung, then it's going to pupate, and then emerge as an adult and exit the dung ball and then go about its own business. So again, another example of some sort of parental care in insects. We also see it in mud dauber wasps. They're going to construct a nest, and they go out and find a spider, paralyze it, stuff that into the nest along with the eggs that will hatch out into the larval form again, and then consume that spider. Some wasps, like this Pompilidae, will kill spiders and then take them back to the nest, or, a little bit of insult to injury here, will kill the spider in its own burrow and then lay eggs there. So make use of what the spider already built as far as a place to live, but essentially just hijack that whole system and take it over. Okay, so we've talked about a few forms of parental care, but let's really now dive into how do we define sociality. One of the first people to try to address this was William Morton Wheeler. He's a great ant biologist. Still refer to his work quite a bit if you're studying ants in North America. He created a system to try to describe the forms of sociality that he observed in his fieldwork. So he broke it down into a system. First attempt at this by anybody, but what we're going to focus on is what a couple of men did. Charles Michener, who's the world authority on bees, essentially. This is his book, The Bees of the World. He's getting to be a pretty senior scientist at this point, but he's still active. But he has a long history of studying the bees of the world, and therefore was in a good position to describe what he saw as far as the forms of sociality. This is Edward O. Wilson. He wrote this book, The Insect Societies, back in the 70s, and then in the 90s he wrote The Ants. This book here, The Insect Societies, is still a really nice synopsis of what we know about sociality and what we would consider the eusocial insects and also other forms. There are other books out there now. This is out of print, this Insect Societies. However, we still refer to it quite a bit because it was a very good piece of work. So Michener and Wilson then took the time to try to categorize the forms of sociality that they observed. And the simplest thing would be aggregation, and that's called communal. All right. The next step would be quasi-social, and that's a parent-offspring aggregation. The next form would be semi-social, which involves a reproductive division of labor. And by that I mean you have an egg layer and then you have workers. Okay, so in other words, queen and workers. Then the final step then for eusociality is cooperative brood care. So the adults in the colony are going to care for the developing brood, in this case the eggs and larvae, and make sure they're fed, kept clean, taken care of in general. So these four things then, aggregation, parent-offspring aggregation, reproductive division of labor, and cooperative brood care, all add up to what we would consider eusociality. Just a couple of extra things here. In the communal form, so they do have some sort of aggregation. it's not parent-offspring aggregation, but just a simple aggregation of adults. In many cases, they're going to share a nest, but do their own work. So if they do encounter an intruder to the nest, they will all defend the nest. And we're going to see this in a variety of bees. Moving on to semi-social, this is where we start to see the reproductive division of labor. So egg layer and workers, and you see dominance interactions, and I'll get into that in just a second. And then eusociality. So here we have the overlap of generations, and generally we categorize these into two forms, primitive and advanced. In the primitive form, we see dominance interactions occurring, and that's going to help establish who's the egg layer and who's the worker. In the advanced forms, that is not as important. We say basically no dominance interactions. I'll tell you about an exception or two there. But for the most part, in the advanced social insects, we're not going to see a whole lot of dominance interactions compared to primitive. So in this case, the pheromones really play a role in determining caste and who's the egg layer, who's the worker. And then we also see discrete morphological differences between the different castes. So what do I mean by a dominance interaction? Everybody, or most of you, I would assume, have seen something like this. You have two rams. They're trying to establish whose territory it is, and in other words, whose mate, or who's going to mate with the female. So they go through these interactions where they crack each other in the head pretty hard, and whoever's the toughest is the one who's going to get to mate. So we're going to see some things kind of like this in social insects as well. When we look at the primitively social insects, things like Polistes and Lasioglossum. So here's a Polistes wasp. It's a paper wasp. Most of you have probably noticed them around your property at some point, or somebody's property. They have the exposed nest made out of wood pulp and water. Forms a nice envelope in some species, but for the most part in the paper wasp, the strict Polistes paper wasp, the nest doesn't have an envelope around it, so it's nice and exposed. Lasioglossum tends to nest in the ground or maybe in decaying wood or something like that. Point is here that in these primitively social insects, we find that the initial brood that's produced is going to be about 10% smaller than the queen. So the queens are bigger than the workers from the get-go. And as I said, they're going to have dominance interactions to establish who's the egg layer. One of the things that's been pretty interesting with Lasioglossum is being able to bring this into the lab and observe the dominance interactions. So when they first encounter each other, they do a lot of lunging and snapping of the mandibles. They headbutt each other, that type of thing. So they'll go through a few rounds of this. If neither insect backs down, then it escalates. And so what we see is what's called the C posture. Okay, so the bees will curl their abdomens toward each other. In other words, it's sort of the business end of the insect, right? So they're threatening them. It's almost like pointing a gun. It's like, I'm bringing my abdomen up because I'm going to sting you if you don't back down. And we see that they'll go to the C posture, and generally one of the bees will back down. If not, they'll continue to do some actual physical interactions. But in most cases, after they realize that they're outmatched, the subordinate bee will lie on her back, and then the other bee will stand over her. Okay, so this always reminds me of canines. So you bring a couple of dogs together that don't know each other, they sniff around for a minute, and then they'll tend to start getting into postures like this. This is subordinate. Here we have the dominant individual. So similar kind of thing that we see in Lasioglossum bees. Once they realize they're outmatched, they'll just lay on their back and the dominant stands above. Similarly with Polistes and Lasioglossum, where the queens are 10% larger than the first offspring. In bumblebees, it's even more distinct. So the initial brood that's produced are called dwarves. They're so small compared to the queen. So here's our queen bumblebee, and then here's some of her workers. She's quite a bit bigger than them. So in both cases, with the paper wasp bees and then bumblebees here again, the individuals retain the ability to reproduce, and so physical subordination is important to establish who's the egg layer. So this general pattern we see in the primitively social insects is that you have a queen. Let's say this is the beginning of spring. She emerges from overwintering, wherever that might be, under a piece of bark, somewhere in a burrow or something like that, any place that provides shelter and warmth. She comes out from that and starts a colony. So she's got to build a bit of a nest of some sort. Her first offspring are going to be small. And again, these are holometabolous insects. So it's going to be egg, larvae, pupae, and adult. Once they hatch out of that pupal case as adults, that's as big as they're going to get. So I'm not trying to indicate that the workers are growing over the season. These are successive cohorts of brood. So first cohort, small, next one larger, larger, okay, until you get to the end of the season, so moving into the fall, and the individuals that are produced are as big as the original queen. Now these individuals essentially don't do any work and will fly away, mate, and then overwinter themselves, and then start this whole process again in the spring. Okay, moving on to the advanced social insects now. These tend to be bigger colonies. The primitive forms tend to have smaller colonies. Of course, like anything in biology, you can find some exceptions to these basic rules. However, advanced social insects tend to have big colonies, and really no physical dominance like we would see in the primitively social insects. But as many of you probably know, we do see some aggression between new honeybee queens when they emerge. We do see some aggression between ant species where multiple queens start a colony. So they'll start a colony together, and then as soon as the system is open and food's coming in, then they tend to fight to the death. However, overall, compared to primitively social insects, the amount of physical dominance to establish who's the egg layer is pretty minimal. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, pheromones tend to play a major role here. Okay, another characteristic of advanced social insects is this, what we call a dimorphism between the worker and the queen. So if you take a look here at the yellow jacket queen, if you take a look at just the width of her thorax here between the wings, you can see a pretty distinct size difference between her and her workers. Head's pretty large too, compared to the workers. So this is a very common thing in advanced social insects. This is where we see some of the most distinct differences between queens and workers. Okay, so to illustrate this a little bit further, what we find is that the queens, because essentially once they found the colony and they have workers bringing them food, they really become an egg factory more than anything. Some would say they're an egg slave, right? They're not really running things, they're just pumping out eggs. And it makes sense then that we would see that their abdomens are often very well developed. This is where the ovaries are, so most important part of the queen, really. On the other hand, when we look at the workers, they're not going to have excuse me, well-developed abdomens. Their heads tend to be sort of wider in general because they're going to need those strong mandibles and therefore muscles to move those strong mandibles in the head capsule. So the head tends to be very well developed. Excuse me. Okay. Here's a nice picture of a queen. Again, the abdomen is very swollen. Her job is to lay eggs. If you take a look here, it's an interesting thing when the ants go on a mating flight to find their males and then mate, the males die very soon afterwards. And then she's never going to need her wings again, so she just reaches back and breaks them off. But for the rest of her life, you can pick her up and take a look and see the scars from where her wings were. Here's a picture of a worker, again, well-developed head, stout mandibles. In this case, it's a major worker. Okay, so these are the ones that are bigger, and they might be called soldiers depending on who you're talking to. But the general term is a major worker. They tend to have even bigger heads than your standard worker. This is one of the things that people find most interesting about social insects, especially advanced social insects, is how do we end up with such discrete differences between workers and queens? Okay, so that's a little background there as far as primitive and advanced and how they establish who the egg layer is. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to go through a couple of points that people find very interesting about social insects and why we study them in the first place. So one of the biggest things that I find interesting really is ecologically dominant for 50 million years. We have really good fossil records of individuals, whether it be ants, bees, or wasps, and then also their nest as well in some cases. So we can see that they've lived more or less the same way for about 50 million years, which is really important. As a person who's trying to survive on this planet, I think we can learn something from species that have been around that long, that we can confirm they've been around that long. One of the things that goes along with being ecologically dominant is moving soil. So a lot of people think of earthworms as moving a lot of soil, and they do. They aerate the soil very well for us. However, ants do this more so than even earthworms. So many of you have probably seen something like this on your property or nearby. So this is the product of ants making tunnels underground and then moving it to the surface. So you can see here, this species moved quite a bit of soil. What's really been interesting in the last 10 to 15 years is this professor here, Walter Chinkle. He's at Florida State. He started making casts of ant nests many years ago, and he started off with dental plaster, and then he moved into molten aluminum because it moves so quickly through the tunnels. So what Walter does then is pours molten aluminum down into the nest, and yes, the ants die in the process. He sacrifices them, so to speak. And what he came to find is that we as ant biologists, when we're trying to figure out what's going on in the nest, we often focus on this part here because it's easy to get to. Right? So if you're trying to understand the society and you're only looking at this much of it, you're missing all of what's going on down below. So it was very enlightening when Walter started to do these type of ant nest casts. Here's another example. So Walter, just to give you some perspective, he's probably about 5'11", something like that. So this one's goes very deep, right? Again, a lot going on up here, a lot of chambers and tunnels, but then a very big drop and goes down very deep. So once Walter started doing this kind of work, we started saying, okay, what's going on down here? What don't we understand yet? This is an image of a leafcutter ant nest. So it's the genus Atta, and they harvest leaves, not to eat the leaves, but to feed the fungus garden that they're cultivating. So they bring the leaves back, chop them up, and then feed the developing fungus garden, and then they consume the fungus. So that's how they live. Atta is known for having huge nests and millions of workers and extreme caste differences within their colony. Ranchers don't necessarily like them because they obviously, even on the surface here, you see lots of different openings, and these are for ventilation of the colony because they're creating a lot of CO2 with millions of workers, plus the fungus gardens are growing and creating heat, so they need to ventilate. So this isn't something that a rancher really wants their cows walking on because it could lead to a broken limb or something like that. So it's sort of a contentious relationship, so to speak, with ranchers and whatnot, and also with other farmers because the Atta workers are going to go out and harvest vegetation. They don't particularly care if it's a crop that you're trying to make money with or something that is a weed, so they don't really discriminate there. So there's a bit of a problem with Atta and either ranchers or other farmers. But what one group of scientists did was to take Walter's idea and pump cement down into the nest like this just to see what the structure was. and then they excavated it. It took a long time to excavate, but these are average-sized guys here trying to excavate this nest. So you can see that a lot of soil has been moved in order to create all these tunnels. And again, millions of individuals, many fungus gardens trying to keep a colony like this alive. So point is, very ecologically dominant, can really influence their local environment, either by harvesting vegetation or just moving soil. Okay. So again, ecologically dominant for a very long time, and another important ecological characteristic is the pollination. So many of you are probably intimately familiar with pollination because of honeybees. However, other insects will pollinate plants, including some of the social insects. So for example, you could have beetles performing pollination services. Different types of flies do the same thing. Moths and butterflies are well-known pollinators as well. However, most of us will think of the honeybee when we think of pollination. That and many other bees as well. We have a lot of native pollinators, but most of us are very familiar with the honeybee because we have such an intimate relationship with them for a very long time. This is usually my take-home message for the people in my social insect class. If you're not impressed by anything I've said so far, you should be impressed with this. $15 billion worth of pollination services every year in the US alone. It's a huge business, obviously, and so it's a very important thing. And one of the reasons people are concerned with things like colony collapse disorder, because we need these pollinators, particularly for some crops like almonds and whatnot in California. So, if nothing else, I hope my students take away the fact that honeybees in particular are very important, but there are a lot of other pollinators within the bees as well. One thing that some folks don't necessarily know is that 50% of American woodland flowers are planted by ants. So that's no small task. And what's going on here in some cases in particular is the seed has an elaiosome. And this is something that the ants find very attractive. It's nutritious. They can bring it back, chew off the elaiosome, hand it off to the larvae, and then the seed remains, and the seed is still viable, and it's tucked away underground or taken out into like the trash pile for the ant colony. And point is, the elaiosome is removed, the ants get something from that. However, the seed is still viable in it, and it will germinate. And so that's sort of the general pattern for the ant planting of American woodland flowers. So here's a real image of that. Here's the seed, and then here's the elaiosome. So the ant's going to take that back, chew it off, hand it off to the larvae. Okay. I've mentioned cast a few different times. So this is something that people noticed a very long time ago when they started looking at ants. And it's like, we have different forms within the same colony. And are these even the same species or not? You know, but once you take a close look and realize they're all living in the same nest, realize there's something going on here, and they seem to have different jobs too. So what we're going to look at is the difference between major and minor workers, males and females, and then is it a female worker or is it a female future reproductive? Okay, so those are the main things people are concerned with. So just to get started, here's the queen again. Big abdomen. She hasn't gone on a mating flight yet. Here's the male who's going to mate and die, and that's it. So they have one job. They don't do anything else in the colony except get ready to fly away and find a future queen and mate with her. And then here we have a sort of a typical worker. So big differences within the same colony. This is Pheidole, the big-headed ant, and these are sisters, okay? Same mother. Could be debatable whether or not it's the same sperm, in other words, same father. These are some of the things people are trying to work out now. But as you can see, if you, at first glance, if you didn't know any better, take a look at those two ants and would not think they're in the same species even. This is the major worker or soldier, obviously huge head, very good at snipping off body parts of enemies, and or husking seeds. So a lot of Pheidole will harvest seed, bring those back, and these major workers will end up acting as a seed mill and just cracking them open, getting the seed out, and then handing that off to larvae. Okay, so one important thing that we need to think about when we look at the difference between males and females is in Hymenoptera, so the ants, bees, wasps, the fertilized egg results in a female, whereas an unfertilized egg results in males. So this first difference here, just between males, and then these are females, the workers and the future reproductive. Okay, that's just a matter of the queen either fertilizing the egg or not. And this is a very important thing and something I'm really interested in because a lot of questions still remain with what is happening in the spermatheca. And this is just a pouch to hold sperm. So here's our ovaries, and then here's the spermatheca. So it's just a way to contain sperm. So in the ants, bees, and wasps, they're going to have one mating event, essentially. They might mate multiple times during that event, but it's all going to happen relatively quickly. So in the ants, for example, we'll have a mating flight. All the colonies in the area of the same species are going to go on the same environmental cues, and so it can be relative humidity, temperature, wind speed, amount of light, all kinds of things. But when the timing is right, they'll all leave. A lot of times pheromones are used to attract each other. They'll mate, and as I said, the males will die, and then she will hold sperm in that spermatheca the rest of her life. So she's not going to go out and mate again. She's just going to hold sperm in the spermatheca and decide whether or not to fertilize or not. And if she does, as I said, that's a female. If not, it's a male. This is really fascinating stuff because the longest lived insects that we know of are ant queens, and we know that some can live over 20 years. So this is a pretty impressive sperm bank, right? If you hold sperm viable within her body for over 20 years, that's really saying something. I don't think we've figured out quite how to do that yet. So interesting stuff, but as I said, they can mate multiple times, so that means there could be sperm from multiple fathers within that spermatheca. And one of the questions that still remains is what's going on in there. Is there some sort of sperm competition? Does she compartmentalize that spermatheca somehow? Does she have any control over what sperm comes out? So those are still very good questions that nobody, to my knowledge, has figured out. Okay, let's say then we have our mated queen. We're going to have males that are unfertilized. Here we can see egg, larvae. It's going to go through multiple molts, then go into the pupal stage, go through metamorphosis, and end up an adult. Or she can fertilize the egg, and it becomes a female. Okay, in this drawing, we're looking at a fertilized egg becoming a worker. Okay, so same scenario, of course: egg, larvae, pupae, then we have an adult. Okay, but what about queen versus worker then? What's happening there? Well, get the embryo here. At some point it's going to shift into being a queen or a worker, and that could be a major worker or a minor worker. And again, the major workers are often called soldiers. Short answer to this question is it all comes down to nutrition. In the honeybees, as most of you know, royal jelly has a major impact on what's going to happen with that developing larvae. There's some evidence to suggest there might be something like that going on in ants. However, most ant biologists would just point to the amount of food given. Okay, so they're going to need a lot of protein and fat as they're developing. The ones that are fed a lot of food then are going to end up as queens. The ones that are starved down, so to speak, will end up as workers. And then within workers, major workers are bigger. They're going to be fed more than the minor worker as they're developing. The queen will get the most. Okay, so this is a picture of an army ant. This is a regular worker here, and then this is the major worker or soldier. So again, just another illustration of how different these can actually be within the same colony. Just like the big-headed ant I showed you, you take a look at this and then this, you might not think they're in the same species. But what we're seeing is nutrition during the larval stage is the most important thing. The army ants are known for their impressive swarm raids. So they have temporary nests called bivouacs here. So they need to stay on the move because when they go out on these swarm raids, they essentially harvest everything that's out there. They kill any arthropod or anything else they can get their hands on and consume it. And so they outstrip the resources in that area pretty quickly. So they have to move the whole colony. And they don't form permanent nests, they just form nests out of their bodies. They just link legs together and form a protective place for the queen and the developing brood. So I bring these up because it's considered some of the most impressive organization of labor in social insects. To see this swarm front moving through, and then all the individuals, after they kill the prey, bringing them back. In some cases they have an area called a booty cache. I don't think they call it that. That's what we call it. So it's a temporary place to put some food. But basically they're going to come back to the bivouac. But then also that means they've outstripped this resource, and eventually they're going to have to move to a new area. But this all falls under the organization of labor category, and it's another thing that people find very interesting about social insects. First of all, who does the work, and then how do they coordinate their efforts? Because it looks highly organized, but one misconception is that the queen of the colony is telling them what to do. That's really not the case. She's tucked away laying eggs. The workers are the one interacting with their environment more so. One thing we do realize is that the most dangerous jobs are done by the oldest workers. So the honeybees you see out foraging are the oldest ones for the most part. That's towards the end of their life. So the joke is social insects, or at least Hymenoptera, they use their old ladies to do the most dangerous things, whereas in our societies we use typically young men. But that kind of goes across the social insects, the most dangerous work done by the oldest individuals. This is Ecophylla. These are ants that make nests out of leaves. They live in trees, and they have to fold these leaves over to form their nest. So we'll see individuals grasping a leaf with their mandibles. They have little sticky pads on their feet, so to speak, and so they can really hang on and start to pull back. You can see a little bit further here, just a few individuals there trying to pull together leaves. Once they do get it pulled together, they go grab a larvae, and the larvae are going to produce silk to form their cocoons once they're ready to go through metamorphosis. But they can also use this silk produced by the larvae to seal up their nest. So they pull the leaves together, go get a larva, and then coax it into producing silk, and you end up with a nest like this. Pretty impressive piece of work there. Architecture in general is a really interesting thing, and that a lot of people have focused on in social insects because it's a permanent representation, more or less permanent, I should say, representation of behavior. Sometimes when you're trying to observe behavior in insects or anything else, nothing happens. So architecture is kind of appealing because you can actually take measurements on it. You don't have to be there in real time to see it all happen. All right, another area of study in social insects is kin recognition. So this kind of comes back to some of the stuff we talked about earlier. If you're going to have a society, you're going to need to communicate and cooperate. And in some cases, it's going to be very important to defend what you've worked for. And that means you need to recognize whether or not an individual belongs in your colony or not. So we see individuals guard nests. This is an interesting ant. Used to be called Colobopsis, but now it's synonymized with Camponotus, which are the carpenter ants. What's going on here is that this individual has a distinctly shaped head. It's a very strange looking thing. You can kind of get a better sense of it here. It's like a plug, and that's exactly what it does. It plugs up the nest. So this individual is approaching the nest and going to do what we call antenate, and tap that plug-headed ant on the head. There's a lot going on with cuticular hydrocarbons in particular. So the hydrocarbons on the exoskeleton give the individuals a distinct profile, and so they can tell whether or not an individual belongs or not. So if this individual is part of the colony, this plug-headed ant will then back out and let her in. In some cases, they have a bigger entrance than they really need, and we'll see multiple major workers, these ones with the plug heads, to cooperate even further to plug it up. Okay, we're going to move into the last thing here, social parasitism, and then be ready for some questions. This is something that I'm very interested in. We look at social insects as being successful, and we know they've been successful for a very long time, and we always point to how they cooperate and communicate and all these things to make them successful. What I find interesting is that some insects have figured out a way to crack that system and exploit it. So there's a lot of different examples of this. This could be 2 days worth of lecture alone, but I won't do that to you. But just to give you a few of the main points here, there's different forms. One is temporary, and this is where the parasitic female, after she's mated and kicked off her wings, instead of starting her own nest, like digging out a burrow and starting to lay eggs, she seeks out a different species altogether and fights her way into the nest. Or she'll trick them in some cases. So a lot of times it's through aggression, but conciliation is another form that we see. So a lot of alamones are involved in that, basically tricking the host workers into allowing her in. Regardless of how she gets in, though, she seeks out the queen and kills her. Okay? At that point, through fighting her way in and then killing the queen, she rubs those cuticular hydrocarbons off onto her own body. So she starts to smell, so to speak, like the original queen. In the cases where the workers are very aggressive to the invading parasitic queen, as they try to beat her up, take her out, they're rubbing cuticular hydrocarbons on her as well. So if she can withstand the attack for long enough, then she'll smell like she belongs. And then she's left alone, kills the host queen. They often go after the abdomen first because that's the source of reproduction. That breaches the exoskeleton, and then the hemolymph, or blood, starts to leak out, and they drink that up and then spend some time just sort of roughing up that dying queen and getting the cuticular hydrocarbons on her. After the queen is dead, her own workers will pull her out, throw her in the trash heap like anything else, and then the parasitic queen starts to lay eggs. So for a while you have two different species living in the same nest. All right, so that's why it's called a temporary form of social parasitism, because eventually the host workers will die off and you're left with just the formerly parasitic species. Here's some real examples of queens that are social parasites. The top three here are known to fight their way in. So you can see dense mats of hair. They're generally fairly big. They're kind of like little bulldozers. These down here are slightly built, but they tend to crank out a lot of chemicals as they enter a nest, and it makes the host workers act erratically, kind of run around. If they get hit hard with some of these chemicals, and they'll spasm and whatnot. Anyways, regardless, all forms here on this page are social parasites. They just have different ways of accomplishing the same thing. Here's another image. This is Lasius latipes. You can see that's a fairly big ant. You can sort of see the hairs here, but what I really want you to see are these plates, and this is what I mean by being like a little bulldozer. Here's another view of from above, so pretty stout little thing. And as she's fighting her way in, she's pushing workers out of the way, etc. And they can't really do much damage to her because she's built so well. And as I said, they'll rub the colony odor off onto her as they're trying to beat her up. This is another species that does the aggressive entry as well. Take a look along the thorax here, and the petiole, and the head. Dense mats of hair, which is also hard to work through to try to actually damage the invading parasite. Okay, so another form is what we call piracy. Historically, it's always been referred to as slavery, or in some cases, doulosis. There's been a movement to not use slavery because it's not really biologically accurate, for one thing, because if you think of human slavery, that's the same species. When we see these pirate species, so to speak, they are going after different species. So it's not quite accurate. And then there's the political correctness issue with using slavery. So right now people are starting to use piracy more so, but it seems to be in flux generally. What's going on here is that the parasitic species steals workers of a different species to maintain their own colony. So it could be facultative. In other words, they don't have to do it. They can kind of do their own thing, but if they get a chance to run over and steal a worker force, they will. They tend not to kill off the colony, though, because they can return the next year and milk it again and get a bunch more workers. One thing I'd like to point out here is that this mandibles are basically triangular. That's sort of the standard plan for most ants. But the ones that have an obligate relationship of stealing worker force, they have these sickle-shaped mandibles. These things are not very good at taking care of the nest, the queen, or the brood even. You can see here it's good for picking up pupa here and running home with it, and they're also really good at fighting. So they're going to encounter some host workers that don't want them to come in because they recognize them as not being part of their colony, and they don't want them coming in and stealing all their brood. So these sickle-shaped mandibles are great at popping a head capsule of an opponent. What we find then is they pick up the pupa, they run back home with it. Eventually, this individual will hatch out of the pupal case, and then it's a very powerful thing. It's called imprinting. So they'll identify themselves as belonging to that colony odor when they come out, and they'll just get to work. Okay, this last example here is called inquilism. This is considered the most extreme form of social parasitism, so extreme that they lost the worker caste. So the queen is only ever going to produce future queens and males so that they can mate. This is one that we find in Ohio. This is a Timnath species. I think this was the 117th species of ant discovered in Ohio. You can see the host queen here, right? They're not going to kill her off, but they're going to ride around on her. So here's the parasitic queen right there. This is another species called AnterGaddy, which is a pretty famous inquiline. Same scenario, going to only produce future queens and males. That's it. So AnterGaddies then will essentially just ride around on the host queen, and the host workers will take care of her. So when she's laying a lot of eggs, she goes into this, what we call a physogastric stage, where she's going to be very swollen, and as you might imagine, there's a lot of egg laying going on, right? This is a big egg factory here. So that's the most extreme form, where we don't even have workers produced anymore. They just get into a colony, ride around on a host queen, produce future reproductives, and that's it. Okay, that's it for the social parasitism. I do want to at least mention that this book here, The Other Insect Society, is written by James Costa. Here he is hanging out. He studied eastern tent caterpillars for his doctoral work, and he found some pretty interesting things in that they live in a communal tent, and then they will do a silk trail to a really nutritious spot on the plant. So in other words, they're sharing information with each other as well. So James and some other authors spent quite a bit of time arguing that this Michener-Wilson system that I presented to you can lead to us ignoring, or at least missing, some other examples of sociality. So this book here, The Other Insect Societies, is a great reference for all other insect forms of sociality other than the Hymenoptera, the ants, bees, wasps, and the termites. So before I finish, I do want to mention I didn't really get into termites. It's they're also eusocial, and again, I could probably go 2 or 3 days on that as well, but I decided to keep it somewhat short. So looks like we're at 9:51, so I'm going to call it there and take any questions that you might have.
All right, thanks, Joe. Really, really interesting and awesome images. I could go for 2 more days, but maybe folks wouldn't listen to the recording that long. A couple questions have already come in. Alan wants to know, why are there 2 or multiple queen colonies, and does it happen in ant colonies too?
Multiple ant queens? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Sort of the general rule is one queen in a colony, but the more we look at it, we find that there's a lot of species that will at least start a colony with multiple queens. And then at that point, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, once they have food coming in, they'll start to have aggressive interactions, and then they'll end up with one queen. On the other hand, there are other species of ant where they maintain multiple queens in the colony. A good example of that would be the red imported fire ant, and that's one of the reasons it's sort of difficult to get rid of. It's because you can kill off one queen, but there's another one ready to go, pumping out eggs still. So it does vary across ants quite a bit.
Okay, great. Elizabeth asks, when you see ants carrying eggs in a weak honeybee colony, are the eggs ant eggs or honeybee eggs?
So ants carrying eggs in a honeybee colony?
In a weak honeybee colony. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what might be going on there is if the colony, the honeybee colony, is weak, dying, not able to defend so well, the ants might just be simply robbing that nest because, you know, any larvae or eggs, or for that matter, if they wanted to get honey as well, that'd be a good resource. But ants are always looking for protein and fat, and an egg or a larval form would be a great resource for them. So I'm guessing that they're probably robbing the nest.
Okay. You mentioned the elaiosome that some seeds have as an ant reward. Is that a carbohydrate source, a protein source, a little of both for the ants?
Yeah, a little bit of both, actually. Yep, you nailed it. So, but as I mentioned, the protein's always going to be a high priority for the developing larvae. The workers themselves, the adults, are, you know, most likely just going to need some calories. So, sugar of some form will keep them going. They don't need as much protein. But yeah, the elaiosome is going to be a bit of both.
Okay, Swarmcatcher asks if ants have a place to grow microbes/bacteria. I'm not sure if Swarmcatcher means on their bodies or in their nests.
Okay, yeah, so there's some interesting things like with the fungus growing ants where they, if they're going to start a colony, they have to bring fungus with them, all right? So they have special little pouches on their body where they can tuck, you know, some spores and then take them with them on the mating flight. As far as bacteria, one thing that's of interest is that ants have what's called a metapleural gland, and they produce antibiotics because they live in the soil for the most part, and they're going to need to remain clean, keep you know, harmful bacteria, fungal spores, things like that that could harm them. They're going to need some antibiotics, and that's what the metapleural gland does. Within fungus-growing ants, though, there are some good bacteria that the ants will keep around the fungus garden. Of course, there's bad bacteria that they try to remove all the time and use some of the substances that the metapleural gland produces. However, as far as the metapleural gland in general, it's to create antibiotics. Okay, so I'm not aware of any sort of special structures where they tuck bacteria like they would with the fungus.
Hey, Carolyn asked if you can repeat the name of the man who did the aluminum castings of the ant tunnels.
His name is Walter Tschinkel. It's Tschincle is the last name. He's at Florida State. And if you get on YouTube, for example, he has some videos, and then some of the people have really taken his ideas and run with it. So there's a lot of videos out there on YouTube about making ant nest casts.